3 Lives 3 Worlds. The Pillow Book. Lower volume. Original work by Tanki Gongzi. English translation, Hamster 428. English editing, Rock Harlequin, Lily, Joanna Kuang. Part 3 Arania. Chapter 5. Despite having seen flowers with the wrong person, Fengju was glad she was smart enough to not say anything inappropriate which would incriminate her identity to Zeiss. Not only that, she also got to hear a gossip directly from Zeiss' mouth. How very lucky she was! Lord Zeiss seemed like an iceberg at first glance, but who knew his feelings for Junyo were so deep? No wonder the mortals say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Fengju, however, became a little worried for Zeiss as she lay down to sleep that night. How blind was this man, truly, for him to see a good temperament and even talents from Junyo. For a handsome man, he had such bad tastes. What a crying shame! She sighed and fell asleep, but it hadn't been long before she rose to wash herself as the rooster crowed its early crows. Last night, she had unrighteously left Su Moi behind to face Changdi alone. She wondered whether he was able to cope with the hardships or not. He might come early this morning for reprisal. If she showed sense early, perhaps he would be soft-hearted and let it go. Decided thusly, she straightened her back and sat inside her cabin to wait and wait. But only until the morning god's rays had permeated to the open expanse did Mo Shao unhurriedly show up. After he arrived, he did not make mention of her transgressions. He only said last night Prince Qing had chased Changdi around the woods amid shrieks and howls. After being swathed by Prince Qing ragged, Changdi had fainted upon returning to the ship. This misfortune had alarmed even the king and queen. After he finished, he concernedly reminded her that Changdi wasn't easy to deal with. For all one knows, she may be seeking retaliation later. Only now did Fengju realize why Mo Shao was so nice today. Without lifting a finger, the person who ditched him was about to get into trouble. Of course he would be happy to feign kindness. Mo Shao was still Mo Shao. Despite the complaint, she kept his advice close at heart. She didn't think Changdi would broadcast such a disgrace for everyone to hear, what with her pride, but how was she to know the king and queen would catch it themselves? In her dictionary, trouble was a bold entry but damage control didn't exist. She had always been the queen of King Kaiyu, and as queen, she had believed it was enough to know how to cause trouble. Damage control wasn't a subject she needed to learn. She felt a hint of shame at her past ignorance. She thought a while and asked Su Moi hopefully, no matter what, Arania is still their Majesty's biological daughter. Even if she is to be punished, they probably won't punish her too severely, right? Su Moi knitted his brow, that's hard to say. 7 days later, while squatting inside a broken cage at Guanchen Palace's dungeon, Fengju at last got to taste Arania's parents' furious brand of discipline. She now knew why Su Moi had furrowed his brow that day. This imprisoning cage was made from the stone which formed Mount Jueku. It could indeed only be considered as a cage, and one could indeed only squat inside it. The slightest movement would lead to immediate contact with the cage walls. She didn't know what enchantment was used on these stone walls, but a single touch was as painful as piercing blades. Absolute torture, it was. Yet this had only been the case after Su Moi had asked on her behalf to face the wall 10 days himself to help her shoulder some of the punishment. If she hadn't had Mo Xiao's generous help, she feared being imprisoned alone would not be enough to lay this matter to rest. In the past, she was also confined whenever she angered Bai Yi, and although she still resented those punishments until now, she only realized today that compared to Arainia's father, her father Bai Yi was still a very kind parent. This pose of a vertical squat was normally already too awkward, now there was even a need to maintain it at all times. While one could freely cast spells in this mock world just like in the original Fanyin Valley, magic usage had been restricted in her cell. She couldn't even use a stabilizing spell though she wanted to. Thanks to good physical health, she held out an entire day, but by nightfall she couldn't bear it anymore and let her back fall against the stone wall. It knocked the air out of her when, instantly, the sensation of 1,000 knives cut through her flesh, so painful it immediately cleared up her mind. This same torture went on and on. On the first day, Fengju doggedly thought all would be fine if she would only put up with it. On the second day, sweat soaked through her clothes and Fengju could only wish someone would come to rescue her. On the third, fourth, then fifth day, she eventually realized this kind of punishment would never stop, it wouldn't end simply by enduring it, and no one would be coming to save her. She didn't know what deep hatred these parents held against Urania to be treating her so ruthlessly. Drowned in pain, from the day she was born till now, this was the first time Fengju thought of dying. When the word death emerged from the depths of her mind, she was jolted by a swift case of sobriety. But before her thoughts could wander further, the dungeon door which had been locked for many days suddenly clicked open. In the backlight stood a delicate silhouette. She struggled to lift her eyelids and saw Changdi standing in the light smiling to her. In the dim dusk light, when she looked as though she had enjoyed enough of her wretched state, she sauntered over and peered down at her from above. She said ever so softly, "Jija, how has prison served you these past few days?" It was already a struggle to listen to her, let alone making a reply. Changdi waited for a second then laughed even more delightedly, "Haven't you always been quick-tongued in the past? Yet you are so quiet today? Or is the pain preventing you from speaking?" She squatted down to be level with Fengju and said, "That prank of yours was quite something, it made the stupid snake chase me around so miserably. But when you came up with your plan that day, why hadn't you thought that I'm not the type to swallow bitterness, that sooner or later I would be returning the favor?" She took another careful look at the cage and whispered, "When father sentenced you to a stone cell to repent, I thought an ordinary stone cage wouldn't be any good, so I privately asked them to especially switch this Juk cage for you. This cage has served you comfortably, has it not?" Because her legs were numbed, her whole body fell backward against the wall once more. The sharp pain induced a cry from Fengju. Changdi propped her chin and innocently asked, "Are you thinking that father wouldn't be so heartless, that once you are released from here, you can fault me in front of him?" She suddenly had a look of scorn. "How laughable, just because I call you Jija, do you think you are really my sister? Father took you on one trip to Guanchen Palace and you've already forgotten the true sort you are? Even if I were to cut you down with a sword, father would only confine me for a few days. Do you honestly think father will slay his favorite daughter only to avenge you?" She sneered, "Urania, from the moment you were born you were already destined to be unwanted." Through Changdi's first few words, because she had provoked her first, Fengju felt Changdi was pretty good to have found a way to retaliate and torture her back. Since she wasn't as good, she had to admit her defeat. But through the latter part, Fengju was glad the one hearing these words was herself and not Aranya. Even as an outsider, she felt rather hurt. There suddenly came noises beyond the ajar prison door. Loud gongs sounded from the distance. Celestial fire, it's celestial fire. Water, rush water to the palace, someone cried out in alarm. The commotion worsened. Changdi all of a sudden reached for Fengju's collar. Fengju unavoidably staggered toward the cage wall where another burst of pain hit her. By the time she regained her senses, suffocating smoke had entered the dungeon. Changdi covered her nose, her eyes shone bright in the smoke as she lightly laughed. The palace is on fire, it may very well reach this place before we know it. Jaja, it seems old heaven pities your meaningless life, hence he is granting you an early release. Fengju struggled for a fraction of breath and firmly pulled Changdi's hand into her cell. She squeezed a small smile onto her lips as she brought her hand to the wall, wanting to let her fathom the taste of cutting blades. Changdi's shrill scream immediately gave sound. Fengju gasped softly, "You can't stand even this much? How unpromising! Your rambling is very annoying. If you've said enough, then get lost." Changdi held her hand and scampered away. At the door, she turned and shot a look full of a spiteful hatred. Smoke swamped the cell. Fengju coughed as she tried to remember. Right before Changdi came, what was she thinking about? That's right, death. Indubitably, there was no afterlife for immortals. Once a fairy died, both body and soul would naturally turn back to dust, where the only existence left was nothing more than vapor gas in the vast cosmos. However, this was the body of Aranya. If this body were to die, her own spirit could quite possibly be freed and return to its original body. At the same time, there was also a chance her soul had merged with Aranya's body, and would live and perish together as one. Foxes had sharp ears. Now as she emptied her mind, her hearing could go even farther. In the chaotic background, only one sound was clear, it was the voice of Zeiss. This convenient husband of Aranya was always so composed, like an ancient lake whose placid surface was without waves or tide. Surprisingly, there were times when just his voice alone could show how worried he was. But his worry had nothing to do with her. Zeiss's voice floated in the air, his question being, "Where is the eldest princess?" She wasn't sure whom he was asking. Fengju momentarily felt sad for Aranya. Figuratively, the celestial fire was a blade which mounted on both her and Junyo's throat at the same time. But her only hope, her husband, was placing his heart and mind entirely on her sister's safety. Wasn't this a tragedy? And again, she had no one left to depend upon. The fire gradually worsened, now licking at the dungeon door. As the saying goes, the raging fire of 1,000 logs, a monstrous fire instantly flourished. In this critical moment, Fengju was exceptionally calm. Her pain seemed to have been evaporated in the heat of the fire. She suddenly recalled the time on Zhukongtian when she was hurt under the claws of Jihan's one-winged snow lion. Not once did the hope of Donghua coming to her rescue enter her head. When she stole the Saha fruit and was trapped in the python territory, she was frightened, but again such hope did not come close to sneaking into her mind. Not having that thought was a good thing, because then she wouldn't have to be sad or disappointed time and time again. Auntie once said it was heaven who determined marital fates. A damsel in distress always had a gallant knight at her side. She grew up thinking this scenario would be the same for her. Perhaps this was only why she fell in love with Dong Hua, who once saved her on Mount Kainyo. But apart from that one time, Dong Hua hadn't helped her again in her moments of need. She survived each time on her own. She endured each time by herself. In any case, she had to wonder whether she would have the same sort of luck this time. Feelings are deep, yet fate is shallow. Deep feelings were herself, she and Dong Hua were the shallow fate. Another word for it would be luckless. She had no luck, which was why she met him, and he had no luck, which was why he let her go. She briefly mused she was such a poet tonight. She also briefly felt she was entirely hopeless, and obviously had spouted lies. She had said Dong Hua Daijun had become 4 mere words to her, yet in this life and death moment, she still thought of him unwittingly. But if she were to really die tonight, would he be sad for a minute's length after the news reached him? Would he lament, "I never thought she would suffer such tribulation at her young age. That year she had tended to my meals 3 times a day in Fanyan Valley. She had taken great care of me." If she could trade her 3,000 years of love and persistence for Dong Hua's words, it meant the karma she had garnered couldn't have been half bad. As the flames licked along the ceiling beams, one snapped and began to fall. Fengju gazed to the ceiling where only bright fire could be seen as it paralyzingly glared down on her. Fengju closed her eyes. In her calmed heart she supposed from dust to dust was still a way to life. She waited for the moment of truth. She was lucky. There was still a way to life. But it wasn't the way to life she had expected. The black-robed man managed to push aside the colossal fallen timber. When he saw her damp forehead and waxen cheeks, he startlingly asked, "They went so far as to imprison you in the Jukwa cage?" Flashes of fury emitted from his stern cold eyes. He raised his sword and briskly sliced the stone cage in 4. Fengju was released in a moment's time, but in a moment's time pain also came rushing back in full force. It crept over every fiber in her body as she groaned in suffering and stumbled over. The young man steadied and held her at the waist. A fire-shielding cloak was thrown over her body and head. "Chen Yat? Why have you come to save me?" Fengju murmured. He did not answer her, he held her and searched for a way out. The originally narrow dungeon had turned into a sea of flames. Fengju didn't think it had ever lit so brightly as it was doing now. Before her eyes was the massive fire, but her nose was feeling very cool. Her mind was aware of the pain still, but this time she really fainted away. A long time later, night wind seemed to be blowing by. There was a sound in her ears, "I created this place in order to bring you back to life. Though you aren't her, if this body is destroyed, what significance would there be in all that I do? I'll surely bring you back, Aranya. I owe you, they owe you. You have to return and take back what was yours." When this voice said Aranya, Fengju could feel a repressed pain hidden within it. But she couldn't tell whether this was a dream or not. When she awoke from her blackout, a silver moon was hanging in the distant horizon. There was no one around for miles, only a few listless flowers nearby greeted her. The fire had left an uneasy aftertaste in her throat. Fengju confusedly looked to the fire-shielding cloak on her body. At length her mind started to click. The palace was caught in a celestial fire which spread to the dungeon. In the most dire moment, Chen Ye had appeared out of the blue to help her escape. She looked to the barren wilderness around her. The only living things within a 30-foot radius were some weary katydids. Her savior had probably changed his mind on the way back and tossed her here on the road. There was a bitterness of medicine lingering in her throat, the pain on her body had partly been subdued. It seemed before being thrown away, she was given a very effective analgesic for treating wounds. Her savior was quite gracious after all. Chilly wind blew across her face, drawing a few sneezes from Fengju. Her previously injured body had incurred a few more afflictions from the past several days of torture. Adding on to everything was the gusty wind at the moment. To have harmful air seeping into her body would likely lead to pneumonia, and when that day came she'd be the one suffering all alone. Fengju fully understood this potential problem. She tightly wrapped the cloak around herself once more and followed the moonlight to a narrow road leading back to her distant residence as she staggered away. The more she went, the less she saw of the fire's traces. When she reached Ziohan Manor, she couldn't see any sign that would indicate the palace had been in a celestial fire only moments ago. It seemed living far away also had its benefits. She entered the courtyard with one push at the gates. She passed through the flowers and plants and headed for the main hall. Sweat on Fengju's forehead had condensed into large beads. On one hand, she admired her heroic self for getting home even in her sickly state. On the other hand, her legs had begun to tremble, and all she wanted to see was a bed so she could collapse right there and then. The main hall's entrance was inches away. As she lifted her hand to push it open, she suddenly heard sounds coming out from behind the carved door, and it stilled her half-raised hand in midair. Fengju slightly peered inside. On a small table in the room sat a long burning candle, behind the candle light was a chaise longue. Presently, Junyo, who should not be here, was lounging lazily across the chaise. Aranya's husband in name, Zai Shenjun, sat on a stool adjacent to the bed with his back turned against the door. His head was bowed as he helped Junyo dress the wound on her hand. Perhaps because he was once the archmage, this husband of Aranya's was not quite like the rest of the Bianiaos. Every gesture he made seemed to have a sub-expression. In his aloofness was a glimpse of laziness, in his laziness was a glimpse of half-heartedness, and in his half-heartedness was a glimpse of indifference. At this moment, as he helped to dress Junyo's wound, there was an ever slightest detection of deviation from his usual actions. He was being careful. Fengju remained at the door momentarily. Enduring the Jukukage's torment might have confused her brain and caused her to enter the wrong house. She quietly turned around. She passed through the flowers and plants again straight for the gates when, suddenly, she saw Cha-Cha coming out from the arching doorway. Her faithful servant Cha-Cha glanced up and detected her presence. After some initial hesitation, she seized her sleeve in jubilation. "Your Highness, at last you brought yourself back safely." There was a large fire at the main palace and a few subsidiary palaces not long ago. I was worried that the fire would spread to the dungeon too. Are you hurt anywhere? Without waiting for Fengju's reply, she quickly went on. The moment the fire started, Mr. Mo had hurried back from his place of penance to look for you. Did you miss it when you come back with Mr. Mo? Fengju glanced at Cha-Cha, then glanced to the hanging eaves on the building peeking behind the flowering tree. She mused, then I'm not lost. But I think I saw Junyo just now. Cha Cha pursed her lips. Lord Zai's residence and the eldest princess's palace were near the main palace. Both were caught on fire. Since the eldest princess is unwell, the queen arranged for her to stay at our place for the time being. She carefully searched for Fengju's expression. Lord Zai's taking care of her is also by order of the queen. Fengju naturally knew why Cha Cha's eyes had flashed that way. Saying she wanted hot tea and rest as an excuse, she sent her away to prepare teaware. Truthfully, all she wanted was a bed to stretch out on right now. She didn't care for tea at all. Ziohan Manor, however, only had top-floor living. Her bedroom was right above the main guest hall. At this time, she did not have the energy to deal with the two individuals inside the main hall. The clustering flowers and plants in the courtyard could be used as a wind shield. Her body seemed to be hanging in there too, so why not sit under the flowering tree and take a little nap? At the same time she would also wait for Sumoy. Her nap turned into a long sleep. When she fell asleep she had distinctly felt a little cold, but by the time she opened her eyes she was surrounded by warmth. She bowed her head to see a man's outer robe draped over her body. A voice entered her ears, "Are you awake?" She raised her head and saw Sumoy sitting on a stone bench next to the flowering tree. Fengju foggily looked at him for a fraction of a second before saying, "You knew the palace would be on fire tonight and that Arania would be trapped in it, didn't you?" Sumoy seemed as though he had expected this question. At length he answered, "I knew there would be a fire today, but in the past when the fire happened, Arania did not step out of Ziohan Manor. That's why I didn't pay attention to whether the fire would spread to the dungeon or not." He looked at her then said, "And the truth is that she never got herself into enough trouble to be locked up inside a dungeon. She and you are different, so naturally the things you encounter would also be different." Fengju could vaguely have guessed this answer. "Since in any case I cannot replicate her life, how will you know the cause of her death? Fundamentally speaking, taking a wrong step will lead you down a wrong mile," Sumoy lightly said. "The variables are as numerous as the lotus petals in Xiang Shui Lake. It's very likely even a sheer sneeze can cause a rippling deviation from the original world. But do you know that in these many variables, there are also those which can't easily be changed no matter what?" Seeing her confused eyes, he went on, "Do you still remember the white lotuses which are formed from people's hearts in the Pundarika pond in front of Taichan Palace? Lotuses in the jade pond change with each season, dawn always comes as night passes, but the thousands of white lotus blossoms in Pundarika pond remain ever unchanged." His voice fleetingly became vague as though he was asking himself, is what's unchanged the lotus, or a person's heart? "A person's heart," Fengju responded. Sumoy looked at her with appreciation. "Yes, only a person's heart doesn't alter so easily. For example, Junyo towards you, for example, Changdi towards you, or for example, the king and queen towards you." His eyes gazed off into the sky. "The clamorous dusty world is merely ephemeral clouds. What I ultimately want to see behind this dusty world are their true hearts toward Arania. That would be the cause of her death." He changed directions and said, "Therefore you can do whatever you want to do without minding Arania's nature in the past. For the few major events, however, remember to make the same choice as she did." Fengju thought a bit then nodded. She rearranged the cloak on her body, leaned against the old apricot tree and raised her head looking to the full moon in the sky. You go ahead, I'll stay to watch the full moon a while. Simoy looked at her for a moment, then gave out a helping hand and teased her. Cha-Cha said your unchanging heart is due to having me for a teacher, bracing against the cold night wind here in the garden is also to wait for me. Since I've returned, there's no need to stay in this misty cold night. Get up and come back inside with me. Spring apricots filled the courtyard, the blossoms were as white as snow under the moonlight. Fengju ignored the hand offered to her and remained looking to the round jade in the sky. After a while she suddenly said, "Have you heard of my story with Donghua Daijun?" She had barely asked when she suddenly realized it was somewhat inappropriate. "The breeze is making me sentimental tonight," she swiftly said. "Pretend you haven't heard anything. Go on ahead." The smile on Simoy's mouth faded. He reached out to the pot on the stone table and warmed her another cup of tea. "Lian Song mentioned some of it to me," he said. "Bai Zhen always said your innate personality doesn't allow you to dwell in sorrow. Right now you look as though you are trying to endure sadness on your own. If there's anything on your mind, you can always tell me. Although my reputation is but false fame, I can still be considered as one of your elders." Fengju remained silent for a while before telling him, "Changdi replaced the stone cell the king had sentenced me to with the Jiuque cage." Simoy's teapot holding hand shook. "What?" Fengju tilted her head to glance at him. "It was nothing, really," she quickly said. "I've taken some medicine for the injuries. It doesn't hurt anymore." She gazed skyward again. "It's just that when I was enduring the torture inside the cage, I kept thinking why it had to be like this for me." Auntie said when she was trapped by High Deity Yao Guang inside the water dungeon, High Deity Moiwan had come to save her. And when she was captured to Dazi Ming Palace, Moiwan again came to save her. Ah, then it seemed Moiwan came to her rescue each time? Then say, hasn't Auntie used up all my luck? Is that why every time I'm in danger I'm always by myself?" Her voice was tremendously calm, there wasn't a single trace of hurt in it. Her last words had seemed a genuine inquiry. Simoy lowered his voice, "Every time." He seemed to see a shadow deep within the apricot garden, but at a closer look, nothing was there anymore. Even as he held his breath he could not detect anyone else's respiration inside the yard. Fengju raised her head and mumbled, "The sort of danger that almost took away my life had happened a few times in the past. If I hadn't gone through those I probably wouldn't have been able to withstand the torture of the Jiuque cage. Because I'm the only granddaughter of the Beis in King Kaiu, I actually have always been spoiled since I was young. Later on, because I liked Donghua Daijun, I came to experience some bitterness and became a lot stronger." She continued after a brief pause, "Actually, I shouldn't say no one ever came to save me. For instance, this time Chen Ye was there to save me, even if he did toss me aside halfway back. I didn't really mind. Most people cannot withstand the Jiuque cage for 5 days, right? I actually survived it, I even got out and came back alone. I'm very pleased and proud of myself." Simoy drained the cooled tea then handed her some warm one. And then. She thought for a moment before slowly replying, "When I came back I saw Lord Zai's dressing Junyo's wound for her. To be honest, I didn't think Junyo's injury was that serious, but Lord Zeiss was bandaging it so carefully, suddenly it left me feeling a little sad. She lifted her hands to her eyes. At that time I felt so much like Aranya, but I also felt sorry for her. If she saw such a scene, she'd certainly feel even worse than I do. And it made me sad because I now got to see how a well-protected woman looks. I despised Junyo's pretense of being hurt by such trivial injuries, yet I was very envious of her. She raised her hands to cover her eyes. Daijun, why is it that every time I need him, he's never there for me? There were times when I thought this way. Whenever I was in danger he never appeared. I told myself it was because we aren't fated, but I didn't really believe that. I thought if I worked hard, heaven would someday be moved. This time, though, I really think if Chen Ye hadn't saved me, I'd have died. I didn't believe we weren't fated before, perhaps because I wasn't thoroughly disappointed yet. Then, do you hate him? Simoy asked after a long silence. Fengju lowered her palms, gazed to the apricot blossoms under the moonlight, and blinked hard. Probably not. I just feel weary. Daijun is great, we just aren't meant to be. You're still very young, Simoy gently told her, you'll meet someone better in the future. Fengju unconsciously nodded. Yes, I'll meet someone better in the future. Simoy smiled, what kind of man do you want to meet? Fengju thought for a second. Although I'm not so weak that I would die if someone didn't come save me from perils, I do hope to meet someone who would help me when I was in danger. Then after saving me, he wouldn't throw me to the side. And when I was sad he'd be there to comfort me. Simoy lowered his voice, haven't you thought about meeting someone who wouldn't let you suffer, who wouldn't let you be in danger to begin with? She did not speak. Simoy continued, does your neck not hurt when you crane it like that? Did someone tell you looking up will stop tears from falling? Don't you know that's a lie? What is it that you are trying to bear? A burst of chilling night air passed by. Fengju was still looking skyward as if the round moon in the sky was full of fascination. Some time later, 2 streams of tears fell from her eyes, followed by low sobs. Then a while more, she finally bawled heartbreakingly. A strong gust materialized out of thin air, bringing apricot petals sprinkling down and swirling turbidly like a snowstorm. Within the flying petals, Simoy once again saw the purple shadow. It turned out his vision wasn't blurred. In the dense petal rain, the purple-robed deity was deathly pale, at his feet was a spilled medicine bowl. His fingers grasped onto an old apricot trunk while his eyes rested on Fengju's body. Fengju remained unaware, she was only crying harder and harder now. He knitted his brow and silently gazed toward her. He seemingly wanted to come closer, yet unable to take that distance closing step. Because of the palace fire, Aranya's 10-day-long penance was rendered moot. Fengju did not kick up a fuss over Changdi's attempt at burying her alive. As Changdi said, even if this matter was called to attention, she would only be receiving a perfunctory punishment. Besides, though it wasn't brought to attention, she was able to crawl back from that pit. If she were to be buried again, she could drag herself out again. Let's see who would stay buried in the end, and whose pit was better dug. Most of the excursion palace lay in ruins in the aftermath of the celestial fire. More than half of the mountain camellias had also suffered, bringing the queen's birthday to a dismal scene. The king was beyond enraged, but since celestial fire wasn't caused by men, there was nowhere he could vent his anger, and looking at the ruins only served to further dampen his mood. Displeased with the sight, he ordered for overnight preparations to return the dragon ship back to the imperial city. White mist glided ceaselessly on the river surface, lanterns hung high on the mast, a few pale stars dotted the sky. Day was breaking. Fengju lay sprawling under a fluffy soft damask quilt as she listened to waves crashing onto the bow. A pleasant scent made its way into her bed curtain just as a question slowly wandered into her mind: if one woke up in pitch darkness and found a familiar stranger next to one's bed, how would one generally react in this situation? Logically speaking, shouldn't she scream loudly, pull her quilt, back away into the corner, and use a trembling yet stern voice to shout, "Insolent scoundrel! What do you want?" But the person in front of her couldn't be considered a scoundrel, and had always treated her as a wooden stake. It was pitch black at the moment. What could anybody do to a wooden stake just because it was pitch black? Having thought this way, Fengju slightly relaxed. She slowly sat up in bed, leaned against the headboard and lit a candle. When she brought the light to the handsome man, she startlingly confirmed that his face indeed belonged to that person. "Lord Zeiss, did you walk to the wrong room?" Illuminated by candlelight, Zeiss did not look well tonight. He quietly studied her for a while with a gaze which seemed to want to dissolve into her eyes. But he made no movement, and she didn't know what he was thinking. Fengju considerately lifted the thin quilt to get out of bed and said to him, "I've had enough sleep. You seem quite tired. Were you too lazy to find your room so you came to sit in mine for a bit? I'll be outside to catch some breeze. If you go, remember to leave the door for me." Her remarks were, in fact, intended to avoid scandals and rumors. Even though Aranya and Zeiss were technically spouses, she was not Aranya. There was nothing to be said between her and Zeiss. In the middle of the night, if something could be avoided, then it was best to avoid. She only lifted her quilt midway before Zeiss's outstretched hand securely tucked her back in. Lord Zeiss frowned as he draped a cloak over her shoulders and handed her a steaming cup of hot syrup. "Has the pain gone away? Drink this," he told her in a softened voice. In spite of his unmoving expression, she could hear the concern in these 7 words. Fengju confusedly took the syrup in her hands. This face and mien should be reserved for Junyo's hurt pinky. Instead, at this very moment he was staying in her room and even bothering himself to tend to her. Had someone hexed him? Fengju raised the candle light to Zeiss's face and sincerely looked at him in concern. "Your lordship, have you got the wrong person? I am Aranya, not Junyo. Or perhaps I really do resemble Junyo to you people who are possessed. But I'm really, honestly Aranya. You are seeing me as Junyo only because you are possessed." Zeiss quietly looked at her for a long while. "I'm not possessed." Fengju became even more dubious upon hearing his words. "Then generally speaking, shouldn't you be tending to Junyo at this moment?" she probed. Zeiss's eyes came to rest on her face. "Is it not a good thing that I'm tending to you?" Fengju took a moment to think. Comprehension dawned on her. "Ah, did Junyo ask you to look after me to make up for what Changdi did? How loving they are to one another. I never thought of bringing this matter to His Majesty's attention. For this you have wasted your care on me, but I'm not sure I deserve it. Actually, I have Cha-Cha to help me with water and tea and similar such. When Cha-Cha isn't here, I can take care of myself. There's really no need for extra help. She handed the sweet syrup back to him, then cautiously said, I know we don't love each other, but you always help the two of them. I think it's somewhat inappropriate. She said inappropriate, but in fact it was more than inappropriate. She felt incredibly offended for Aranya, but with her identity, she could only say this much. She calmly brought her gaze back to Zai's again, and was surprised to find him dazedly looking at the syrup in her hands. At long last he replied, this has nothing to do with them. Then he lifted his head to look at her. Today I only gave you a cup of water, but you don't even want to drink it. There was clearly no expression on his face, but when these words came into her ears, Fengju was made to feel a little crestfallen. She didn't drink it at first because she didn't want him to compensate her in Changdi's stead, but since he said that wasn't the case, to reject him again would seem unamenable. She received the cup and stammered, I wasn't thirsty before, but now I am, then downed the sugary water. The syrup was obviously sweet, but she could almost instantly taste the tang of fresh blood. She was unsure whether her taste was malfunctioning from the torture of several days ago. Speaking of the torture several days ago, she recalled that taking Chen Yi's medicine had only reduced her pain in half. Last night while conversing with Mo Xiao in the apricot garden, her body was still in constant pain. Yet at this point in time, inexplicable comfort enveloped her. Indeed, when one was young, one's bones were strong and a good sleep cured all ailments. While she was lost in thought, Zeiss had taken the porcelain cup from her hands and placed it on the table. Then he helped her lie down and said, there is still some time before sunrise. Get some more sleep. Fengju did feel a bit sleepy after drinking the syrup, but Zeiss' actions tonight had her awfully befuddled. When he lowered his head in near proximity, she could also smell the faint fragrance of white sandalwood. It gave her a nostalgic sense of familiarity. But if Zeiss wasn't possessed and wasn't amending on behalf of Changdi, could he have alternatively caught his head in the door? Mild incense swarmed the room. Conducive to resting, it aided Fengju well. She had many questions to ask, but they were immaterial compared to sleep. As she was about to give in to somnolence, she suddenly heard Zeiss' voice in the darkness, that night you said you had once loved someone. A pause. That person had made you very disappointed, hadn't he? Fengju's heart gave a thump. That night she mistook Zeiss for Su Moi and led him to go see Yueling Flowers. Subsequently she told him there was once a person she loved, but he was to be considered a terrible man. More than 10 days had since gone by. Now that Zeiss suddenly asked, she didn't know what he was referring to. In any case, it was unlike Zeiss to ask this question. In her view, Lord Zeiss was an immortal possessing profuse divinity. Not only in the Bianiao clan, even the notably stern elders she knew would have a difficult time matching his otherworldly aura. Later on, when she learned he had feelings for Junyo, she still didn't feel it to be true. She always had the impression that his feelings were blocked by a layer of airy divinity. Truthfully, it did not feel very much like an earthly kind of love, and thus she didn't expect for him to ask such an earthly kind of question. Although he insisted he wasn't under black sorcery, she worried he might have been struck with it. Seeing her in lengthened silence, Zeiss said, "He had indeed made you very disappointed." Fengju sighed under her quilt and awkwardly said, "It really doesn't matter whether I was disappointed or not. It's just that sometimes love needs the presence of fate as well. I spent a lot of time gambling on this fate, but in the end I didn't win. Only recently did I comprehend the tragedy of insisting on a fate which we don't have, and was enlightened quite a bit. If there is something your lordship is unable to see, we can discuss about it." Night was dark and quiet, but she was able to feel Zei's eyes intently fixing on her. "If he now appears in front of you, will you still doubt that there is fate between the two of you?" Fengju laughed, feeling extremely sleepy now. "The word fate has never existed between the two of us. I've wagered on myself for so long, it's about time to let it go. So you see, whether he appears or not this time wouldn't really make a difference. It would be better if he doesn't come. I don't really want to see him." A long time passed before she heard Zeiss say, "Truly." "Truly," Fengju replied in sedateness. She then mumbled, "I actually understand why your lordship said these things to me tonight. I know you've always been reluctant to be in this marriage, and are afraid I'll cling on to you. You're hoping I can find someone soon? You don't have to worry about this, everyone has his own fate in life. I'm feeling really sleepy, if there is anything else let's talk about it tomorrow. When you leave, help me close the door." Zeiss no longer spoke. Fengju thought he was probably embarrassed because she had seen through his mind. She felt she was especially skilled tonight to be able to read someone's heart. Yet for some reason the room was filled with a sadness which overwhelmed her. Zeiss remained in her cabin even after she fell asleep. She did not hear the door closing upon his exit. White sandalwood interspersed with the fragrance of incense, lingering on indefinitely. Fengju slept past noon. She was so hungry she couldn't stay asleep on an empty stomach. Coincidentally, beyond the door Cha-Cha was receiving Sumoi's oral instructions inviting her to the bow for some grilled fish. Fengju's sleepiness dissipated at the deliverance of this news. When she looked around before closing the door, she saw that the furniture in her room had been put away neat as a pin. The small embroidered stool Zeiss moved to her bed last night to sit on was now firmly resting at the foot of the bed. The cup of syrup she drank from also went away without a trace. It was as if she had never woken up in the middle of last night, and the conversation she had with Zeiss was but a figment of her dream. She went to the bow and looked around. Sumoi was holding a fish kebab as he stood beside a broken stove, looking back at her with a grimy face. The ever-elegant Mo Xiao was a master at brewing tea on fine charcoal. He had probably assumed the fire used for brewing tea was the same one used for grilling fish, not knowing they were entirely different. Her stomach crawling with ravenous bugs, Fengju watched Mo Xiao make a mess and the promise she heard suddenly turning into flitting clouds in the sky. He had invited her out for fish, but looking at this situation, he had really asked her out to grill fish for him. Mo Xiao pointed to the mahogany box next to him, and albeit shamefaced, smiled charmingly at her. "I knew you'd hurry over because you'd be hungry with nothing to eat. I've especially prepared a bowl of porridge for you." Fengju was pleased to see that Mo Xiao still had some conscience left. She drank her porridge without further decorum. It was a sweet porridge, gooey, soft and fragrant, but for some reason whenever it entered her throat, there was always a hint of bloody tang on the tip of her tongue. Aside from this hint of blood, the taste was otherwise remarkable. Seumoy watched her finish the porridge, then pointed to the feet of the barrel, still smiling his charming smile. "If you're done eating, then teach me how to grill these fish. They were hard to come by. Lord Zeiss especially said having them grilled is beneficial for you." Regrettably, though I'm well versed in books and swords, fish grilling in particular is a bit. Upon hearing the name Zeiss, Fengju abruptly choked on her last gulp of porridge the moment it went into her mouth. Mo Xiao swiftly handed her a drink. Whatever it was, it still tasted like the sweet syrup from the night before. Fengju swallowed the syrup with difficulty to wash the porridge down and foggily looked at Seumoy. "These fish are from Lord Zeiss too? I thought there was something wrong with him last night, as if he was possessed. It seems he really is suffering some very bad witchery if he still hasn't come back to sense even now. Instead of giving these fish to the royal chef, he left them to your authority. Since when did you two share this type of rapport?" Seumoy seemed surprised. "Didn't Lord Zeiss say anything to you after he carried you back to the ship last night?" Fengju was even more surprised. She stared at the syrup in her hand and said, "I was in a bad mood last night, so I stayed in the apricot garden to cry. After I fell asleep from crying, wasn't it you who brought me back to the ship?" Seumoy calmly handed the fish kebab to her. "That's not the case at all." "Well, last night quite a few things had happened." The second Fengju let her unbridled tears fall, a gust of wind came into the quiet apricot garden. Seumoy wasn't sure if it was from the emotions of Donghua Daijun, who was hiding in the back. Burst after burst of turmoil, then burst after burst of chill. Seldom did the carefree prince of the West Sea visit Zhukongtian to pay homage. Even so, he was informed of Donghua Daijun's reputation for being an emotionless and desireless deity. For the first time he found that the universe's master, too, had feelings all along. Her crying went from loud sobs to whimpering sounds, then gradually lowered into inaudibility. Fengju leaned against the tree with his robe draped over her and fell asleep in tiredness. He had intended to bring her inside and was about to get up from the stone bench when the purple-robed deity had gone over to the apricot tree, bent down, and picked Fengju up, all while looking as though he had been waiting just for this moment when she would finally fall asleep. Seumoy had met Donghua Daijun once when he was a child. The mortals lived in their earthly realm while the fairies resided on the three heavens of purity. Still, he had thought that above the earthly realm, the superior king had also transcended outside and beyond the three purities. In his eyes was an indifference, as though the heavens and earth contained nothing more than empty void. Back then he had thought, perhaps this was the aura of one who owns the universe. Once in this world, he recognized he was different than he had been, but because they were so far apart he couldn't really see what it was. Now as he stood in front of him, his arms holding a sleeping Fengju, his eyes showing a rare hint of softness, he came to understand what the difference was compared to that year. Something now existed in Daijun's eyes. The rapport he shared with Zeiss, which Fengju referred to, was merely in the form of a question Daijun had asked before he left. Arania had a teacher named Seumoy. "You're not the Seumoy of this world, but from Fanyan Valley. Have you come and replaced the original?" Before, there were a few things he could hide from Dong Hua because he had been too concerned about Fengju to detect anything else. Now that Fengju's identity had been revealed, he knew he could no longer hide the truth and naturally confirmed. Dai Jun then asked, "Did Lien Song ask you to come in here to find Xiao Bai and me?" At first, of course he had to pretend he didn't know that Zeiss was in fact Dong Hua. But he then admitted that Lien Song had asked him to help them escape from this place. He had done everything he could to prevent Dong Hua and Fengju from recognizing each other just for his own selfish motives. This time when he saw that they were about to recognize each other, he did not stop them because he had felt sorry for Fengju. Should Dong Hua want to immediately bring Fengju back, there was nothing he could do. As for Aranya's karmic matter, he'd simply have to take a few detours. Unexpectedly, kindness rewarded him. Dai Jun gazed to the distance beyond the garden and said to him, "It was I who kept the truth from her first. For now don't tell her who I am. Mystical energy are purer here compared to the outside world, suitable for her to recuperate. We won't leave for the time being, you don't have to go back either. Help me look after her when I'm not around." The sound of a sneeze brought Sumoy back from his reverie. Fengju rubbed her nose and asked him, "You asked me if Zeiss said anything when he brought me back on board. I've spent quite some time thinking about it, but he said what seemed to be a lot of gibberish which I cannot wholly remember. Did he mention anything to you?" Sumoy thought about it and cryptically smiled. "Nothing at all." End of chapter 5.